May 1943, near Sfax, Tunisia. The desert night was brittle with silence. Private Harold Benton crouched in the sand, the weight of the new weapon biting into his shoulder. In his hands, it looked absurd. A steel tube, a clumsy spring, and a warhead that seemed too heavy for the spindly contraption meant to fire it. Around him, men of the 1st Infantry Brigade muttered under their breath. One snorted. "Looks like the lads from the plumbing corps finally joined us," someone said. Laughter rippled through the slit trench. The weapon, officially the Projector, Infantry, Anti-Tank, or PIAT, had arrived in crates marked Experimental Ordnance, Do Not Drop. And yet, that seemed to be all it was good for. A weapon built out of desperation and pipe fittings given to infantry who had already seen what real tanks could do. Benton pulled back the spring-loaded spigot, grunting with effort. It took nearly 200 pounds of force to cock. "Bloody hell," he hissed. "Feels like trying to bend the gates of hell open." Corporal Hughes, the squad's realist, squinted at the instructions. "Says here it don't even use gunpowder." "Then what does it use? Prayers?" Hughes smirked. Spring and faith. The British Army was running out of both. In North Africa, Rommel's panzers had made sport of the light Crusader and Valentine tanks. The infantry's boy's anti-tank rifle, once considered revolutionary, was now a relic. Its 55 caliber rounds pinged uselessly off German armor like thrown stones. The PIAT was Britain's answer, a homemade salvation, built in a rush by Major Millis Jeffress of the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. But here, in the desert, the soldiers didn't see genius. They saw a joke. The laughter died when, from beyond the ridge, the clatter of tank treads rolled like distant thunder. A Panzer III emerged under the moonlight, its turret sweeping, its machine gun already chattering. Benton froze. Hughes hissed, "Get ready." The PIAT's warhead, a 2.5-pound hollow charge, gleamed faintly in the dark. Benton pressed it into the spigot, his hands trembling. He'd never fired one before. No one had in combat. The Panzer advanced, 50 yards, 40, 30. Benton aimed low, his breath shallow. He squeezed. The spring snapped forward, slamming the spigot into the bomb's tail. There was no flash, no roar, just a sharp metallic thunk, and the round arced silently into the dark. A second later, the desert lit up. The explosion tore through the Panzer's side, molten copper from the shaped charge slicing through armor, spraying white fire from the exit wound. The tank lurched, its turret sagging like a wounded beast. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Hughes whispered, "Well, I'll be damned." The Germans had stopped laughing. Would you have believed it? Had you been there that a spring and a pipe could humble steel? June 1942. London, England. In a cluttered basement beneath a Special Operations Executive's workshop, Major Millis Jeffress adjusted his glasses and glared at the pile of failed prototypes. The air reeked of oil and singed canvas. "We're not designing a rifle," he said. "We're designing a miracle." Across the table, a junior engineer muttered, "With a spring the size of a bed frame." Jeffress ignored the remark. He lifted a steel tube, its surface crudely welded, and set it into a vise. "A man should be able to kill a tank without calling in artillery. That's the problem." He tapped the side of the pipe. This is the answer. Simplicity is survival. The problem was physics. Britain's earlier anti-tank rifles relied on sheer kinetic energy, bullets that struck with brute force. But as German armor thickened, energy wasn't enough. The new idea was chemistry. The shaped charge. A hollow cone lined with copper that, when detonated, focused its energy into a jet of molten metal, hot enough to pierce even tiger armor. But that charge had to be delivered safely, and the delivery system, the PIAT, would be as strange as its creator. Instead of gunpowder, Jeffress used a spigot mortar principle, a spring-loaded rod that struck a percussion cap on the bomb's base. The resulting explosion not only launched the round forward, it recoiled the spigot backward, recocking the weapon automatically. A self-contained loop of violence. No cartridge case, no flash, no smoke. Silent. Reusable. Terrifyingly unpredictable. When Jeffress demonstrated it at a proving ground outside Farnborough, officers from the War Office looked on with skeptical smiles. One colonel whispered, "It looks like something out of a scrapyard." Jeffress didn't flinch. He aimed at an obsolete tank 80 yards away. Pulled the trigger. The warhead struck, and the tank's hatch blew open in a geyser of flame. Silence fell over the crowd. The colonel cleared his throat. "Noted," he said flatly. "Though perhaps we'll keep this one for the Home Guard." The War Office considered the PIAT an embarrassment, but Winston Churchill didn't. The Prime Minister, fascinated by eccentric inventions, approved limited production, 100,000 units. It would replace the boy's rifle in 1943, just as the war was about to shift from the deserts of Africa to the hedgerows of Europe. Back in the field, soldiers like Benton would soon realize that the PIAT wasn't just an oddity. It was a monster, one that kicked like a mule, misfired in mud, and punished the careless. And yet, for all its faults, it had one unmatched gift: silence. In Italy, as Allied troops clawed their way through mountain passes and village ruins, that silence became a killer's blessing. November 1943. Sangro River, Italy. Sergeant David Mack McAllister lay in a shell crater with his section, watching a German armored column crawl down the slope. The rain had turned the fields to soup. Their radio was dead. No artillery support, only the new PIATs, each wrapped in oilcloth. Mack spat mud and whispered, "They won't hear us fire. That's the trick." The men readied their weapons, their breath fogged in the cold air. As the lead Panzer IV rolled past, its treads hissing in the muck, Mack rose from the crater and fired. The bomb punched through the rear armor, a perfect strike. Before the second tank could pivot, another PIAT flared. 2 tanks, gone in seconds. The ambush was over before the Germans understood what had hit them. The PIAT had found its language, close, brutal, and personal. History never repeats, it remembers. What does this one remind you of? June 10th, 1944. Normandy, France. 3 days after D-Day, the hedgerows around Villers-Bocage were thick with smoke and cordite. Private Harold Benton was back in the fight, older, dirtier, and far less inclined to laugh at the PIAT slung across his shoulder. The weapon was heavy, nearly 15 pounds without the bomb. It dug into his back as he crawled through the overgrown lane. Around him, the men of the 6th Durham Light Infantry whispered, "Tanks. Left side." The sound came before the sight, a deep, mechanical growl, like an iron beast breathing through its vents. The ground vibrated beneath Benton's chest. Then, through the hedgerow gaps, he saw the silhouette of a panther. Low, angled armor glistening under drizzle, its guns scanning the lane. The British Sherman ahead of them had already been reduced to a burning shell. The German crews were hunting infantry next. Sergeant Hughes, still alive, still carrying the same dry humor, hissed, "All right, Benton, you've got the pipe. Make it count." Benton's hands shook. He knew the PIAT's bite. He'd seen it rip tanks open in Italy. But here, in the bocage, distances were cruelly short, 30 yards, maybe less. He crawled into the ditch, heart hammering. The PIAT's crude trigger guard caught on a root. He swore under his breath, adjusted, and peered up. The Panther's turret swung slowly, its gun barrels slicing through branches like a guillotine. He waited for the moment the tank turned, the exposed belly between tracks and armor plate. "Now," Hughes whispered. Benton rose just high enough to aim. He fired. The PIAT thumped, recoiling with a force that slammed him flat. The warhead screamed across the lane and hit just above the treads. A flash, then a pillar of fire. The Panther's engine compartment detonated, a thunderclap in the hedgerow silence. The turret lurched, flames pouring from the vents. The crew scrambled out, blackened and dazed, one man's uniform aflame. Benton's ears rang. His shoulder throbbed from the recoil, but the weapon had recocked itself perfectly, ready again. He grinned for the first time in days. "Pipe rifle, my arse." 2 more Panthers followed. The squad fell back behind the hedge, reloading. They passed the word, "Wait for them to cross the lane." This time, every man in the section had one. When the German armor rolled through, the hedgerows erupted like volcanoes. 5 PIATs firing in eerie silence, the bombs tracing short, arcing paths into steel. The first tank stopped dead. The second burned from within. The third backed up in panic, straight into an American bazooka team waiting down the road. Hours later, when the smoke cleared, a war correspondent walking the field counted 6 destroyed vehicles and found pieces of PIAT fins scattered like black petals across the mud. The photographs would later circulate among German units. Some tank crews began to fear the quiet lanes more than the skies. They called it der stumme Tod, the silent death. It wasn't victory they sought, but survival. If that moved you, let it stay with you. December 1944, Arnhem, Netherlands. The snow fell in thick, soundless sheets. Buildings stood like broken teeth against the sky. What had once been a Dutch suburb was now a white graveyard of twisted trams, shattered windows, and the muffled clank of distant armor. Inside a half-collapsed schoolhouse, Lieutenant David McAllister, now promoted, crouched beside the window, scanning the street through his binoculars. Below, his section of paratroopers from the 1st Airborne huddled in the cold. They had 1 Bren gun, a handful of rifles, and 3 PIATs. "Movement," McAllister whispered. "Mark that alley." Private Benton, transferred and hardened by 2 years of killing steel, nodded, his PIAT resting across his knees. He'd long stopped mocking the weapon. He'd seen what it could do when everything else failed. Down the street, a Panzer IV crept into view, its turret twitching. The sound was strange in the snow, muffled, almost soft, like an animal stalking prey. German infantry followed close behind, rifles at the ready, shadows flickering under a dead winter sun. "Range?" Benton muttered. 40 yards, McAllister replied. "Wait for the angle." The building groaned as wind pressed through broken glass. Every sound was a risk, even the click of a safety. Benton braced the PIAT on the sill. His finger rested against the cold metal trigger. The tank rolled closer. 20 yards. 10. He fired. The recoil slammed him backward, knocking snow and plaster loose from the ceiling. The bomb hit the Panzer's side. The explosion turned the street into a cloud of dust and fire. German shouts filled the air. The second PIAT fired, then the third. When the smoke cleared, 2 tanks burned in the snow. German soldiers scattered, dragging the wounded away, their breath visible as ghostly trails in the frozen light. The British didn't cheer. They simply reloaded. Benton rubbed his shoulder, grimacing. Bloody thing kicks harder every winter. McAllister allowed himself a thin smile. And still they call it a pipe. They held Arnhem for 2 more nights. When the counterattack came, they were down to their last bombs. The PIATs became not just weapons, but symbols. Defiance in steel and spring. Men carried them, even when the spigots froze, just to look the enemy in the eye and remind him that British infantry still bit back. After the war, McAllister would write in his diary, "We laughed at it first, then we swore by it, and by the time the snow came, we were praying it wouldn't let us down." I've seen men die with their hands still on the PIAT, smiling. You tell me if that's madness or faith. Some names were forgotten. Others still echo. Which would you remember? April 30th, 1945. Hamburg, Germany. The city burned like a dying star. Smoke rolled over rooftops as the Allies pushed street by street through what remained of the Reich's defenses. Sergeant Harold Benton, gaunt, exhausted, his uniform caked in ash, ducked into a doorway with his section. He had carried his PIAT since Normandy. The paint was worn, the grip smooth from months of grime and blood. Outside, the clatter of machine guns echoed down the alleyways. A Tiger tank, the last of its kind in the sector, prowled the street like a wounded lion. Its 80mm gun roared, reducing a British half-track to molten steel. The infantry froze. Benton looked to McAllister, now limping from a shrapnel wound. The officer said nothing. He didn't have to. "All right, you bastards," Benton muttered, dragging the PIAT to the window. "One more time." He pulled the spring back. It groaned, protesting years of wear. The mechanism clicked into place with a sound that felt ancient, almost ceremonial. He waited. The Tiger moved slowly, its turret sweeping, smoke leaking from its exhaust. The war was ending, everyone knew it. But for the men on this street, it wasn't over until that tank stopped breathing. Benton steadied the PIAT on the sill. Through the cracked glass, he could see the white Balkenkreuz painted on the tank's flank. 50 yards. He aimed for the rear plate. The weapon fired with its dull, hateful thunk. The shaped charge struck, a blinding flash, then silence. When the smoke cleared, the Tiger was still. Its hatch opened, a figure emerging. The tank commander, uniform blackened, one arm clutching his chest, he took a step, then another, and fell face first into the rubble. Benton lowered the weapon. The war for him had just ended. He sat down, breathing hard, the spring hissing softly as it recocked one last time. McAllister limped over. "That it?" Benton nodded. "That's it." They watched the smoke drift skyward. No cheers, no victory cries. Just the low hum of a broken city and the quiet relief of men who had outlived their odds. Later, when British engineers entered Hamburg to document the weapon's effectiveness, they found something remarkable. In one district alone, 14 tanks had been destroyed by infantry PIAT teams, more than by all artillery in that area combined. The Germans, who once laughed at the pipe rifle, began recovering PIATs for study. Some commanders noted in captured reports, Silent, low muzzle flash. Dangerous at close range. Recommend avoidance of enclosed areas where British infantry may employ it. It had become the most feared anti-tank weapon in Europe, not for its range or power, but for what it represented. The stubborn ingenuity of a soldier forced to fight monsters with his hands. When Benton turned his weapon in weeks later, the armorer signed his receipt and said, "Hell of a thing, wasn't it?" Benton smiled faintly. "It was ugly," he said. "But it never failed when it mattered. History never needed it to be beautiful, only brave. Would you have carried it, knowing what it could do?" September 1945. London, England. The war was over. Europe exhaled at last. But inside the Ministry of Supply's Ordnance Review Room, the conversation hadn't stopped. It had only changed. A row of engineers stood before a table lined with trophies of ingenuity. The American bazooka, the German Panzerfaust, the British PIAT. Each told its own story of desperation turned into design. An officer in a crisp uniform tapped the PIAT with his cane. "Ugly thing," he muttered. Major Millis Jeffers, older now, eyes ringed with fatigue, smiled faintly. "Ugly saved lives," he said. Across the channel, reports poured in from every front. The PIAT had knocked out over 1,000 enemy tanks and countless fortified positions. It had armed resistance groups, airborne divisions, even Polish partisans in Warsaw. Soldiers carried it through mud, snow, and ruins, cursing it, loving it, depending on it. But in London, post-war analysts debated whether it belonged in the future. Rockets were faster, recoilless rifles more elegant. Yet, as Jeffers reminded them, elegance never crawled through a ditch under fire. He lifted the weapon one last time, as if weighing its soul. This was made for the man who has nothing else left. No tank, no plane, no artillery. Just courage and 30 yards. The room fell silent. Out on the streets, soldiers demobilized by the millions. In pubs, stories spread, tales of Normandy hedgerows, of ambushes in Italy, of that ridiculous pipe that sent tigers burning. Some veterans joked it was the only weapon that hurt its user as much as its target. Others said they owed it their lives. In the Imperial War Museum, curators uncrated the first PIAT for display. Its metal was dented, its paint chipped, its spring still functional. A small plaque read simply, "Projector, Infantry, Anti-Tank, PIAT. In service 1942-1950. British invention, responsible for the destruction of enemy armor far beyond expectation." Visitors walked past it without knowing the weight behind those words. Benton, now home in Manchester, saw the same weapon years later, behind the glass. He stood there for a long time, motionless, remembering the sound it made when it fired. Not the explosion, but that strange metallic thunk, followed by silence and the smell of victory mixed with cordite and fear. He whispered, "It worked." His reflection in the glass blurred into the outline of the weapon. A soldier and his tool, both forgotten, both remembered. The PIAT would eventually fade from arsenals, replaced by sleeker, simpler designs. Yet its legacy endured in every modern anti-tank weapon. The idea that one man could face armor and win. And somewhere in the echo of its spring, history still hums a quiet truth. Ingenuity is born not in triumph, but in desperation. If this story spoke to you, keep its memory alive below.